Oh, it's gone. We're good.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to the presentation. My name is Josh Kerber. I'm the post-award manager for finance at the University of Oregon. So I run our central office billing and reporting. And as part of that, I'm also in charge of the university's risk assessments for outgoing subawards. Um, and I just wanted to open by saying you're going to hear the word audit a lot during this presentation. I know that can be upsetting for some people. We're hoping that by the end of this presentation, we've demystified it a little bit and helped bring that stress down. Because Robert and I both believe that audits are good and useful, and hopefully we convince you of the same. Robert, do you want to introduce yourself and then take us into the agenda?
Certainly. I'm Robert Prentice. I'm a senior financial analyst in the Subaward management team in the Office of Sponsored Projects at Yale University. We have three parts to the agenda today. We'll first talk about how the single audit came about, the problem it was intended to solve, and how its role has changed over time and been expanded. We'll discuss how a single audit report is structured. And then lastly, and perhaps most importantly, we'll talk about the very important role that the single audit plays in how research organizations monitor their subrecipients. Now we have to start the story about 50 years ago in the 1970s. This was a time when federal agencies were issuing more and more grants to state and local governments. Now, these were not research grants. These were mostly grants to provide social services like healthcare, job training, childcare, housing assistance. And one of the frustrations that the state and local governments experienced were the audit requirements associated with those grants. At that time, each federal agency and sometimes individual programs within agencies had their own audit requirements, and they were not in any way coordinated. So if you were a state and local government and you had grants from 15 agencies, you might have 15 sets of auditors arriving every year. It was also not an ideal arrangement from the perspective of the agencies themselves or really from the taxpayers, because the audits were mostly superficial. They were looking at the correctness of financial statements, making sure that revenue and expenditure amounts were correct. That's important in private enterprises, but with public funds, we're also interested in the overall integrity of the systems, what we would call today their internal control environments. We want to know if they're paying people, that those people actually worked on the project and that they're being paid the correct amounts. And that if someone is traveling or purchasing supplies, that those activities are truly necessary for the completion of the project. So the audits were not particularly good at minimizing waste, fraud, and abuse. So in this period, there were different ideas being bandied about by different agencies. And in 1979, the General Accounting Office, they have traditionally acted as the legislature's watchdog over the agencies in the federal branch, in the executive branch. They issued a report with the wonderful title, Grant Auditing, a Maze of Inconsistency, Gaps, and Duplication that Needs Overhauling. And they summarized the problem and they proposed a solution, which is outlined in the third paragraph, and I'll just read it. It says the ideal in auditing grant programs is to have a single audit of the recipient that would be acceptable to all of the funding organizations. This audit should assure that the recipient's financial records and controls are adequate and check for compliance with important terms of the grants received. Such audits would be made periodically when needed. Funding organizations would then be free to perform additional audits of economy and efficiency and program results as deemed necessary. So what they were proposing was a centralization and a simplification of the process that made both sides of the equation happy, but also left space for agencies to conduct their own audits when necessary. And so 5 years after that GAO report, Congress passed the Single Audit Act, which at the time was applicable to state and local governments. And since then, it's been a real success story. The GAO continues to comment on the single audit. They have a report out in April of this year. 6 years after the passage of that Single Audit Act, it was extended to cover private nonprofit organizations, such as private universities. And then 6 years after that, when the very first subrecipient monitoring requirements came into being, the single audit was central to that function. The new requirements in 1996 directed pass-through entities to use what the federal agencies had been using successfully for the past decade or so. Now, Josh will go into greater detail about the structure of single audit reports, but at the highest level, it's a description of an organization's structure and its finances, particularly what it does with federal funding, and an evaluation of how the organization is able to comply with the requirements associated with federal funding. It's that evaluation of internal controls for compliance with federal awards that's special about the single audit. There are other types of audits out there, but they generally don't include that specific element. The other important thing to note is that it's a process. It's not just that the audit identifies problems, it also outlines plans for their remediation. And we frequently only hear about the worst audits, about the scandals, but the vast majority of audits make slow and steady improvements to the organizations they cover. On the right side of the screen here is the State of Washington audit that is about 1,300 pages. It covers a lot of agencies, so they are big and complex documents. Now, there's a little bit more on this topic that we can cover in the space of an hour, but we wanted to share some links to regulations and resources that go into greater depth. The audit requirements for audits and subrecipient monitoring requirements are found at 2 different locations in the Code of Federal Regulations. For domestic, nonprofit, and governmental organizations, their single audits can be located and read in an online repository known as the Federal Audit Clearinghouse. One other thing to note is that there are some foreign and for-profit organizations that are required to undergo single audits, not because of a federal-wide policy, but due to agency-specific requirements. Those audits do not have an online repository. You'll hear the phrase internal controls come up a lot in this presentation and in many others, and it's important to know that that term is elaborated upon in a book called the Green Book, issued by the GAO. Does a great job of explaining what it means to have an effective internal control environment. And lastly, there is a positively gigantic document known as the Compliance Supplement. This is the auditor's handbook. It tells them how to conduct a single audit and gives them guidance on how to test for various compliance requirements. And I'll pause for just a second before we move into the next section to see if anyone has any questions at this point. Okay, I will turn things over to Josh, who will tell us about the structure of a single audit report.
Thank you, Robert. The outcome of every single audit is a report that summarizes what happened in the audit. That's the primary way that the vast majority of us interface with single audits. And every single audit report has the same 4 components. It has 2 letters that talk about what happened in the audit, what procedures were done, what management responsibility is. It has a schedule of expenditures, which is just a table listing all of the grants by program cluster and how much money was spent on them during the year. And then it wraps up with a schedule of findings, which is a summary of how the audit went, and then a listing of any findings that came up. And of the 2 letters, one is way more interesting than the other. And it's the major federal program report. When you're doing a single audit, you have to look at every award that comes from the same funding source, which functionally is the same CFDA. And if it is a big enough portion of your total grant take, then it qualifies as a major federal program and gets extra scrutiny. The major federal program letter also has an opinion on the compliance environment. They'll say, here's what we found, here's what we looked at, and we think this is or is not providing a good control environment. The other letter, the general auditing letter, does not have any such opinion, which I've always enjoyed that they don't repeat it in both, but so be it. Can you jump us to the next slide, Robert? As far as report opinions go, there are 4 that you would encounter in the wild, and they are sorted here from least alarming to most alarming. The assumption going into an audit is that everything is good, that all of your controls are working, that you have appropriate controls, that nothing hinky is happening. Assuming nothing comes up during the audit to counter that perception, you get what's called an unmodified opinion. That's really good. That means we can rely on that audit and those internal controls with confidence. If the audit turns up some problems, but problems that are neither pervasive enough nor severe enough to call into question the entire control environment, then you'll get a modified opinion. And in that opinion, they'll basically call out, here's the areas where we found weaknesses. Here's the areas where things weren't working as intended. For everything else, unmodified. The catastrophic result would be the adverse opinion. That's where the auditors looked at your information. They came out and their report says, we do not believe that there is a functioning control environment associated with this organization. There are problems that are severe and pervasive. That's not a single audit report we can confidently rely on. And then the last opinion, which I don't know that I've seen in the 11 years of working on single audits that I've got, is the disclaim opinion. And basically that's the auditor saying something happened that prevented us from completing the audit. There was either a specific incidence or a general lack of data available to us, and we are unable to ascertain with confidence whether the controls are or are not working. Let's go to the next one, Robert. This is an example of the major federal letter, or major programs letter, sorry. This is the University of Oregon's 2023 audit. And down there at the bottom in that red box is the opinion. Oh.
Sorry about that.
Minor technical difficulties.
Hang on.
Hey, that's promising.
Okay.
There may be slight wording differences, but an unmodified opinion will look very much like this. In our opinion, the agency complied in all material specs with the compliance requirements referred to above that could have a direct and material effect on each of the major federal programs for the year. There's a lot of hedging language in there. Talks about material effects not once but twice. Talks about having a direct effect. The audit is not going to find every possible problem. The audit is going to provide a general level of assurance, a statistical confidence. But it's always possible that they missed something. And it's also possible that they found something and it was small enough that they didn't believe it would have a material impact.
Josh, can I ask you and Robert a question there? You mentioned
Yeah.
material impact, and for some of us who either aren't as experienced or don't know that, can you two speak as people who have seen that when they talk material? Can you kind of either give us an example or kind of like is there a threshold or is there something that they're looking at where they say, that is material as opposed to, this seemed like more of a immaterial? Is it like a one-off
Sure.
kind of idea, or is it a pervasive, systemic thing? What's your experience on that?
There's kind of 2 avenues that they would look at for determining materiality. One is just size. If you've got $100 million of grant funding, suppose you're the University of Oregon, and they find an error for $10, they're probably not that concerned about it because no one's going to look at our reports and say, oh, they only had 99,999, $10 doesn't make a difference. No one cares. That's rounding error, essentially. The other thing that could bump something into materiality is sort of what you were driving at there is a pervasiveness, a perniciousness. If they have reason to believe that there is someone who is intentionally subverting your control environment, even if all they've been doing is stealing one penny from the take a penny jar every day. The fact that there is such a breakdown in your control environment and that you have someone who is being a bad actor would probably make that material, even though it's not very big. Robert, other thoughts?
We have an example in a later slide of different types of findings. And so we'll return to this subject again, but that's an excellent question and an excellent answer.
Cool. Let's see, what slide are we on? Oh, I took our 2023 letter because it's sometimes very difficult to find these non-unmodified opinions, these opinions of concern. So I modified our letter just so you could see an example of, had we gotten a modified opinion, what that opinion statement would look like. And the modified one looks almost exactly the same, but it does call out, here's the areas where we found items of concern. Otherwise, everything is fine. For the adverse one, there's more problems, and they're somewhat more alarming. Problems with personnel management and cash handling in your research and development cluster is never what you want to see. And the language there, due to the nature and severity of these findings, Yo did not comply in all material respects. We could have had these same findings that were not as severe and gotten away with a modified letter, possibly. And then that last one, the disclaim opinion. If you get a disclaim opinion, there'll be an extra paragraph that describes what went wrong. We were unable to complete the audit because the records office was flooded, and we were unable to review any records because they were destroyed by a natural disaster. For that reason, we're unable to determine whether these can be relied upon or not. But that, as I said earlier, that's the rarest opinion that I don't know that I've ever actually seen one in the wild. I saw one when I was a tax auditor, but not since moving to universities in the single audit. And this is the summary of findings, and I've split it over 2 pages just to make it more legible. The top section is basically a restatement of how the audit went. And it touches both on the financials and the single audit. Basically said, what was the opinion? Did we find any problems? Check the box, yes or no. And then the next part of it will have, if we go to the next part of it. Yeah, there it is. It will identify everything that was a major program and the opinion on each major program. Unmodified here is nice. It'll have this box or this question that I've got here highlighted in red is deceptive. Auditee qualified as a low risk auditee. That is for the purposes of doing a single audit on this institution. We as the auditors have assessed the risk of having a bad audit, not finding anything, but just having an audit that doesn't work right. And we have decided that these are a low risk entity. And so we will, we don't have to do the extra level of checking that a higher audit risk entity would have. And then the last part, section 2 or 3, are a list of findings, which in 2023, we were very boring and didn't have any. So we've got an example finding on the next slide. And this is from our 2018 audit. We had a significant deficiency in our internal controls. And every finding will be laid out like this. It'll have an identifying number, a description. It'll say what was impacted. In this case, it was our R&D cluster, which is, the biggest and most pervasive of our research dollars. And then it'll explain basically what happened. In this case, the criteria was we're supposed to submit our reports on time, and we didn't. You'll see there in the condition, it says they found 2 that were filed late. There were no question costs. If there had been, we were doing our travel incorrectly or we weren't managing personnel correctly, they might have assessed a dollar amount to attach to that error. In this case, since it was report filing, there was no financial impact to it. And then the context there, they looked at 12 reports and 2 were late, which is, if you're a student of statistics, that's a pretty bad hit rate. And the second half of the finding, they try to assess what went wrong with the effect and cause there. They make a recommendation. We should establish a control system to make sure that we're getting stuff in on time. And then that last section is what Robert was hinting at earlier with the, here's the corrective action plan. Here's what we're going to do so that we don't have this finding in the future. Oh, and in the middle there's that repeat finding. If we had had this finding in 2007 or 2017, sorry, and then again in 2018, they would indicate that this has happened before, it's happening again. And that's a warning sign that whatever our corrective action plan may not be working. Or there may be something else going on that's preventing us from fixing this problem. So it's a little bit of an item of concern. I believe, yeah, that's the last of my structure slides. So before we jump into a more nebulous discussion of how this ties into risk assessment, are there any specific questions on the structure of that report? Could you re-explain the oddity qualifies? Yes, yes, I can. That's a great question. So this is the auditor looking at the history they've had with the University of Oregon, looking at the size of our books, looking at the preliminary surveys they've done, and saying, how big a hassle do we think these people are going to be to audit? Have we had errors in the past? Have they had problems getting documents from us in the past? Have they had to come back and ask for the same documents over and over and over because we couldn't get them what they needed? In this case, we hadn't. We had no major problems. So they said, yeah, this should be a relatively straightforward audit. We don't need to do any extra stuff on top of our normal responsibilities in an audit. If we did not qualify as a low risk auditee, then they have a whole extra set of things that they check on because we, the people giving them information, now need to be audited. They need to make sure not only that the data they're getting ties out and the questions they're asking are being answered, but they're now also looking at how are we interfacing with them? Not just what happened last year, but what's happening right now in the audit. So a higher risk auditee gets more audit procedures. For the purposes of the risk assessment, it's not saying that these people aren't risky and you can put them in the low category and not put anything else in the contract. And it looks like it is. That's why we specifically called it out. Robert, you had something?
Yeah, the other thing to mention is that the formal criteria for a low risk auditee are outlined 2 CFR 200-520. There are 8 paragraphs. They will tell you exactly what you need to do to get this qualification. Sometimes I hear people say this organization is high risk because they're not low risk, and they don't really use that terminology. Low risk is like a gold star that you either get or you don't get. In the comments, Carrie Chesbro asks, is it true that new entities will not be low risk for the first 2 single audit years by default? That is an excellent question, and I don't know the answer to it.
I think I do. I think the answer is yes. I think one of the requirements is 2 years of satisfactory audits.
Okay.
So if you're a new organization and don't have 2 years of audits, you don't qualify through no fault of your own.
One of the requirements is also that you receive an annual audit, and there is a state, I think it's Montana, that only gets an audit every other year. And so institutions that are under the state of Montana audit can never be low risk.
That sounds like a pretty good gig. And guys, I posted in the chat there as well the CFR section that you mentioned, Robert, where it outlines it in the 5 points, and getting to Carrie's question, part E mentions audit findings from any of the following preceding 2 audit periods. So if somebody has not had an audit period in the previous 2 years, I think that would mean they are by default falling into that category. But please read the CFR at your leisure. This, if you would like.
Speaking of the CFR, here we're going to start our third and final section, which is the role of the single audit in subrecipient monitoring. We're going to talk about specific requirements found in the federal policy, and in areas where there are just sort of broad requirements, but not specific guidance. We'll discuss some common practices that institutions see as reasonable and prudent. We don't always have clear guidance on every step of the process here. It's more a matter of what is reasonable and prudent, and what is agreed upon between institutions and their auditors. So the requirements for pass-through entities are in 2 CFR 200-332, and they require that pass-through entities review the single audits of their subrecipients within 6 months of the audit's posting in the Federal Audit Clearinghouse. Some subrecipient audit findings require pass-through entities to issue a formal communication regarding those findings, known as a management decision. Now, the policy on management decisions gets kind of deep in the weeds. There are lots of ins and outs and what have yous. We've cited some of it on the left, but the gist of it is that management decisions are issued when the finding affects the pass-through entity directly. And on the right is an example of a made-up finding from a fictional Yale subrecipient that would require us to issue a management decision. In this instance, the subrecipient charged an unallowable cost, and the auditors found it in the course of their review. And it only affects Yale University. It was only us. It's not a systemic issue. And so the management decision that we would issue to the subrecipient would either sustain or not sustain the finding, either agree with it or not, provide the rationale for doing so, and then outline the steps that the subrecipient would need to follow in order to resolve the finding. In this case, they would need to pay the money back. We would tell them, please remit to us a check to the following address, et cetera, so that we could then refund the cost to the prime sponsor. When it comes to the broader question of how organizations use the single audit results of their subrecipients in subrecipient monitoring and subrecipient risk assessment, we're no longer really in the realm of specific requirements, but in general practices. And everyone will have a slightly different perspective on this. We all have our own portfolios of prime sponsors, subrecipients, our own histories of problems that have come up that we don't ever want to see come up again. We also have, in some cases, large groups of subrecipients that are not subject to the single audit at all. And we might want to worry more about those than we do about our single audit population. At the same time, it's a good idea when responding to audit findings, or really in any situation involving subrecipients and pass-through entities, to always turn these questions around and consider how things look from the other direction. What if your own organization had an audit finding and pass-through entities were evaluating what to do about it? It's a helpful exercise because at the level of the individual agreement, one organization is a pass-through entity and another is a subrecipient. But at the level of institutions, we're all part of a big network of collaborators, with subawards sometimes going in one direction and sometimes in the other. And I think it's important to talk about these things and have a sense of what it means to have a healthy network in that respect. So we mentioned before that every audit finding comes with a corrective action plan. And it is frequently the case that by the time you read an audit, the plan should have already been completed. And you can sometimes make judgments about those plans, or you can always make judgments about those plans. Sometimes they can be a little bit glib and unconvincing, and you can tell that the organization may not be serious about it. Other times, they can be an indication that they take the finding very seriously. I once reviewed an audit that disclosed that the chief financial officer had moved restricted funds in an unrestricted manner and had issued misleading financial reports to the board of directors in an attempt to conceal a cash crunch. And the first bullet point of the corrective action plan was, we fired the CFO. And there were many bullet points after that. So you can get a sense of how the organization is either handling or not handling the problem. So the following year, auditors evaluate the success of the plan, and if the underlying issue is still unresolved, they will issue a repeat finding. And that is a sign that the process for resolution may not be working. These do come up every now and then. I know of one very large university that has had a repeat finding related to equipment finding for a decade now, which would be very much concerning if you were issuing a subaward to them that involved equipment.
Which is a nice segue into our common sorts of findings. There's lots of different findings that you will see a lot of different times, some of which you may worry more about or less about. You know, if there's findings around student financial assistance, that's an important area, but we don't do a lot of student financial assistance with our research. They tend not to have any impact at all on what we're doing. Similarly, we saw in the last spate of audits a lot of COVID relief funding, and that seemed to be much more down to just how complicated the rules were around that funding rather than any specific flaw with any specific institution. Robert mentioned equipment. I would throw in the same category as that, travel and participant support. Those are only worries if your subrecipient is getting funding in those areas. If you have a subrecipient who consistently has problem with their travel, but all they're doing is staying at their home lab and doing samples, you probably don't need to worry about it too much. The areas that you're always going to have the hairs on the back of your neck rise up a little bit, payroll is always a concern. Unallowable or misallocated costs, obviously, is not something we want to see on our grants. And I would throw in here also the timing on reports and revisions to reports. And that's primarily down to if you've got a subrecipient who is consistently 3 months late getting good data to you, that could very easily impact your reporting up to the prime award. So that's something that always needs to be considered and always needs to be corrected for. Otherwise, your reporting becomes unreliable. And that's definitely not what we want. Robbie, you want to jump to the next one? We also have even within a single category of finding, not every finding is the same. There are things that are more or less problematic. Robert came up with this great example, and I think I've stolen this slide from him, but I'm just going to press on. Imagine that you have a policy that says we have complicated, sensitive documents that we keep in this filing cabinet with an electronic lock. And the auditors take a look at it and they say, yes, you have them locked up in a appropriate receptacle, but the code hasn't changed in 6 years. So anyone who has had access to that in the last 6 years still has access to it, which may not be what you want with sensitive documents. Sort of a more alarming finding up to the level of a significant deficiency would be there's a lock, but everybody in the office knows what it is. You know, maybe the password is written on the filing cabinet. So it's not really doing the job. But you are at least trying to follow your policy, which is why it's only a significant deficiency. The material weakness would come, there is no lock on the filing cabinet. Nobody has done any auditing of it. We have no idea what's happened to those sensitive documents, and we are not following our policy. That's when we get into the material weakness category. I think something popped up in the chat, but I was mid-talk, so I missed it.
Yeah, no, the filing cabinet example is always awesome. The question comes from Hannah, who asks on the previous slide, guys, the universally of concern section. She's wondering if it would just be concerning if the finding is under the R&D cluster, or would you still be concerned if those types of findings were in G throughout HR, or basically anything outside of the R&D?
Always look into it. And that's kind of why they're universally of concern. If I saw anything around payroll, I would make sure I read that entire finding from start to finish, probably twice through, looked at the resolution plan, and obviously if it's in research and development is worse. It's more alarming. But particularly in big universities, the research dollars tend to spread. And if there's a problem in payroll that was detected in one area, you have to wonder if that problem does or could exist elsewhere. Even if they didn't find it when looking at something, if there's a hole in the control environment, then it could happen. It's not necessarily something you have to write up. It's not necessarily something you have to control, but it's definitely something I would always be looking at, if that
I
helps.
think I think that's a really good answer, and a lot of these bigger schools where you work, Robert, where you're at, Josh, and everything touches everything, right? You're kind of one big wheel, and you have a lot of spokes, but somehow this touches this, touches this, touches this, even if it's indirectly. Sorry, go ahead, Robert.
Well, there is always this question of, should we just pay attention to R&D cluster findings? And I think as a practical matter, for many institutions, that answer is yes. If you're a large university, you can get really deep into the weeds in reading these audit reports. But if you are a three-person office of sponsored projects and you have subawards and you're required to do all of this, you might want to have a very simple process that does not go deep into the weeds, that nevertheless serves your purposes. And so I would say probably 99.5% of the time, it's only R&D findings that matter to me. Every now and then I will see a financial statement finding that shocks me. But this is a really excellent question that gets into the variation among institutions. We have a very centralized subboard group where we can get really deep into the weeds into these questions. That's not always the case at every institution that is required to follow this policy.
If I'm remembering our slide order, we're going to talk just a little bit more about that in a moment.
Yeah. And Josh, I believe you had described a significant deficiency, but had not yet gotten to a material weakness. Is that right?
I think I touched on it, but I'm happy to touch
Okay.
on it again. The material weakness comes not just when the control is not working, but when the control isn't being followed. So in this case, they don't have a locked cabinet, which is two problems. One, because they don't know what's happening with those sensitive documents, and two, because they said they would lock those documents up. It's in our policies that those documents get locked up, and they're not. So that's kind of two strikes in one swing. I don't know much about baseball, but I imagine that's how it happens.
I think it's also worth pointing out here that what we have described as a finding could also not be a finding. It might not actually rise to the level of finding, depending on how it comes up and how things are going. Generally, it could just end up being a suggestion from the auditors. And if we had another hour, we could talk about the business of actually interacting with auditors and how to do so to effectively represent one's processes and one's institution. But there are gray areas and there are ambiguities, even though this is trying to put some formality upon them. Okay, back to you, Josh, to talk about risk.
Talk about risk. Yes, controlling risk. And this ties right back to your question about which findings do we look at. Every institution has its own risk tolerance. Every institution has its own ability to look at these and respond to them, its own criteria, its own concerns. Everybody has had that one thing or those two things that went wrong over the last decade that everybody is really nervous about. That's going to get more scrutiny. And that's, there's no central platform. There's no objective correct or incorrect answer to what your risk tolerance is. It's something that your institution has to decide. And once you've determined your risk tolerance, then you can go through and look at the single audit and say, is this of sufficient concern that I need to try to control this risk? Or is this something that we are comfortable letting it fly on? I've got some examples here of different ways you can control risk. You can write extra terms into the contract. You can mess with the timing of the contract. At the University of Oregon, our subcontracts are only for 1 year. Even if we've got a 5-year project and we know we're going to have the same collaborator for 5 years, they get 5 different subordinate contracts. They get one every year. And we like doing that as part of our risk control, because then if something comes up in the next audit, we can easily respond to it. And maybe they get a new finding that we need to control for, or maybe an old finding got resolved. If the year one contract has, concerns about travel and we wrote in they need to send us receipts, they get their next audit and everything is a-okay, they resolved it, we can probably take that clause out and rely on their internal controls because the audit says we can. For the timing of contracts, and you can tell this is one that my institution is particularly concerned about because this is the second time I've talked about it. If you have people that are slow getting you reports, or you have people who consistently come back 3 months after they've given you a report and say, actually, there was a mistake on that, you can write a contract that doesn't have the same end period as your prime award. You can have their funding year stop 3 months early so that they have their 3 months to mess around and get you a late report, and you still have time to get that information into your report and out to the sponsor. That's okay. And then the last thing on here, site visits always comes up in conversation around controlling risk, and I don't know that a lot more is said about it, so I wanted to make sure we touched on it briefly. Site visit can be in person, it can be a Zoom call, it can be with technical staff, it can be with administrative staff. Figure out what you want to see before you do a site visit. If the audit said there's concerns about how their administrative staff are working, set up a time for your admin people to talk to their admin people. If they're concerned about the lab, have your staff take a look at their lab. You can leverage the PI and the department level staff for that because they already have those connections probably. But don't just kind of wing it. Make sure you know what you're looking for before you do that site visit. That would be my advice for that. Other things you might run into, which means other things that I've run into. Universities audited as part of a state, or if you have like a school of medicine that's a subcomponent of a larger university, something like that. Make sure you're paying attention to that may have a material and direct impact clause in the opinion. If you're looking at a state university that has a budget of $100 million and a state that's doing $1 billion worth of trade, you have to have a really big problem for that to show up on that audit. One of the best things I ever see when looking at those state institutions is that the organization I'm looking at has a single finding that is not alarming to me, because it means they were big enough to get looked at by the auditor, and the auditor looked deep enough to find something, and I'm not worried about it. Another problem we've talked about before, we'll talk about again, it's everyone's favorite topic, persistent findings. If the same finding keeps coming up over and over and over, it speaks to a failure of the ability to control that or a lack of desire to control that. And in either case, you can consider how that impacts your risk tolerance and what you want to do to control it. Maybe you agree with the people you're subawarding to, and that's not something worth fixing, but maybe you don't. Maybe you think, yeah, why don't you send me all of your documentation around travel? Why don't you get pre-approval for travel? Because you're not fixing your system to the auditor's satisfaction. And then the last concern, changes since the audit. Since audits are backwards looking, it's possible that new things have come up. The single audit is not the end all be all of your risk tools. One example we had, the audit was through 6/30. There was a new unit put together 9/30, and here we are at 11/30 issuing a subaward to that new unit. Even though the institution's been audited, that unit never has. It's entirely brand new, and we had to consider, how much do we want to rely on the existing policies that were audited, and how much do we want to consider them new and perhaps a higher risk because of it. And the next one, Robert.
We have some questions to pose to the group. What are the pain points in your processes of reviewing audits, performing subrecipient monitoring? And how does your own organization respond to the audit findings of your subrecipients? What do you find concerning? Or what do you do differently than what you've seen here today? thought we would pose those questions to the group and entertain answers to those or any other questions that you might have.
As some people ponder the questions, I wanted to ask both of you. One common question I see is, when do you take a look at subrecipient monitoring? I know that's one that comes up as an issue for a lot of us in terms of maybe an audit, finding an audit risk at your institutions, and that's kind of getting in the weeds, but is subrecipient monitoring, looking at that kind of stuff. Do you do that at the award stage after you know an award is being made by a sponsor, or do you take a look at that at the proposal initial stage to see if you even want to start an engagement or work with that institution individual on a case-by-case basis?
Do you want to start with this one, Robert?
Yeah, this question comes up a lot because the idea of doing a formal risk assessment at the proposal stage just seems completely unfeasible. We just had a webinar internally last week where we said, we do these assessments at the award stage, but there are certain types of organizations that have certain qualities. We know it's going to be a really difficult time with them at the award stage, getting, say, compliant PHS financial conflict of interest policy, or having them obtain a unique entity identifier. And there are a variety of characteristics, like they're very new, they're very small, they've never had any experience with federal funds. You can verify that in usaspending.gov. They're in a country that has a reputation for public sector corruption. There's a group that puts out statistics on that called transparency.org. Those sorts of qualities. And if you see two or more of those at proposal stage, it's probably a sign that you should start working as early as possible on getting all of the necessary documents and confirming that they have the ability to comply with the terms of a federal award.
That's a really good answer, Robert. I don't know that I have much to add, honestly. We also look at it when the award is made. Our hit rate is not so high that we can afford the staff time to run a risk assessment on awards that never get made. It'd be nice if we had that kind of staffing, but we don't. Yeah, and we have also talked to our pre-award people about, identifying some obvious red flags that maybe would involve the risk assessment and the subaward process earlier. But mostly what we have done is made a big point to remind our faculty frequently that subawarding is a separate process from receiving an award. And just because your award says I'm going to subaward to these people, it's possible that that won't happen. And they should make sure that they have an alternate plan. And if they can't come up with an alternate plan, maybe this isn't the funding opportunity that they should be applying for. And they hate it when I say that because I sound so reasonable, but it's me saying no too. So, did another
You're a
question pop
very
up in the chat?
experienced research administrator. I can tell. Yes, Carrie had a good question. I don't know if you guys can read that or if you'd like me to read it.
Why don't you read it aloud in case anyone is working on their other screen and just listening?
That would never happen in research admin, but just in case it is, can you speak to UG single audit requirements versus sponsor agency single audit requirements? There seems to be some confusion in this area for the entity types that are not under UG, but are subject to agency requirements when they're funded, which I think you touched on a little bit at points during your presentation.
Robert, you talked about that a little bit on history. Do you want to expand?
Yeah, this is an area that I am frequently confused by myself, so I'll do my best. My understanding is that there are three federal agencies, NIH, CDC, and USAID, that impose broadly audit requirements of their own on foreign or for-profit organizations. One thing we didn't talk about in this presentation are the various thresholds in order to receive a single audit. Right now, the threshold is you have to have spent $1 million in federal funding in the previous fiscal year, then you undergo a federal single audit. The thresholds for those agency-specific requirements are different. For NIH, they are keeping it at $750,000. For CDC, it's 300,000. And so the way it works is that if you have, and correct me if I'm wrong, say you've got some federal funding, say you have $500,000 of federal funding from the DoD. You may not be subject to any audit requirements unless the DoD in their individual awards subjects you to them. Then you get a CDC award, and now you have over $300,000 of federal funding that you've spent in a fiscal year. The CDC then imposes an audit requirement on you, and it may be a single audit, or it may be something called a program-specific audit, which is a little bit narrower in scope. You can get very deep in the weeds, and there's a lot of confusion around these, and I think certain agencies are trying to clarify a little bit more. But I would love to have more clarity, and I dream of having a repository for these audits, because it can be a real challenge to find them, to request them from the organization, and to get them. I was once directed to, I corresponded with a portal, and I was asking for this audit, and they came back and said, well, you'll need to contact the principal investigator. I don't want to contact the principal investigator to get an audit. That's not right at all. So this really does provide a window in what it was like before. It was like this for everything in the old days, where you had to get the audits directly from the institutions themselves. So my hope is that there will be more progress on that. I think in the latest round of uniform guidance updates, the OMB said that they were going to be looking at for-profit audits in the next round. Who knows when that will be? But I would very much like to see progress on that front at a federal level.
I would just like to add to that in the most broad sense possible. I will happily look at any audit that I can get my hands on when doing a risk assessment. If all I can get is a financial statement, I'll read through that and try to pull out any clues that I can. If they've got a single audit, that's great. If they have an agency-specific audit, that's great. If 3 years ago they had an audit that I can find on their website, I'll take whatever I can. Sometimes that means I have to educate myself on what this audit actually is before I can use it. But if it's information that's out there and there's been a second set of eyes on the books, that's the best tool I have for trying to satisfy myself about what the risk actually is.
Excellent. I think we have time for one last one from Hannah here.
Okay.
Hannah says, what do you do with subs that don't have a single audit or foreign subs in terms of yearly single audit monitoring?
It's a great question. And slightly outside the scope of this, unfortunately, but broadly, I would look for whatever else I can. And if I can't find another set of eyes on their books, then I will treat them as though with the same risk tolerance as if they'd had an adverse or a disclaim opinion on a single audit. And I will say I don't have any confidence that I can rely on their internal control system. Robert disagrees.
Well, one common way to deal with this is to send the organization financial questionnaire that asks them directly about the state and the quality of their internal controls, and have it come from someone in a financial role that knows what they're doing, and then to trust that. That's one component. The other component is at the department level, there's typically more contact with the subrecipient directly. There's the approval of invoices, the receipt of financial reports. They often know which subrecipients are complying generally and which aren't. And so that information from the departments can be very helpful in making judgments among the non-single audit population. That's an excellent topic for another webinar.
Robert, just to tie into that, since we're not quite late yet, one of my favorite terms to add if I'm concerned about risk is to have a statement of progress accompany an invoice, and then have the PI verify that that tracks with their understanding of the project. And that's very helpful in terms of trusting that they're doing what they're saying they're doing.
That's a great idea. This is where you can find us. We're happy to talk offline if you have questions that come up later. Reviewing audits is a very specialized function. There's typically not a lot of people within an organization that do that. And so it's helpful to talk amongst ourselves and compare notes. And we're happy to do so.
Absolutely. Thank you both for presenting, sharing your time and knowledge with us. You both are fantastic. I wanted to close with our last slide here. So in closing, thanks to everybody for attending. I dropped the link in the comment section there. But if you could please complete the evaluation, we would love to hear your feedback, both on how great Robert and Josh are, and also if you have topics for future events like this that you'd love or want to hear about. And if you're enjoying all this, be a member. If you're not an Incura member already, please follow the link. Join us. It's a fantastic community that helps knowledge sharing, just like you saw today. And in terms of future events, in November, we're going to have a Lead Me session with Jen and Ashley to inform you what the Lead Me program is all about and how incredible it really is. So thank you all once again for joining. Thank you for our speakers, and we will hopefully see you all at the next event. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.